KZSU-FM Stanford. Happy New Year again, and welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture on the Hearsay Culture Network. My name is Dave Levine. I'm the Associate Dean for Faculty Development and Professor at Elon University School of Law, as well as an Affiliate Scholar at Stanford Center for Internet and Society, UNC Center for Information Technology Policy, and University of Milan's Information Society Law Center. We are thrilled to have on the show a prolific author and scholar who writes in a variety of spaces. The author is Pico Iyer, and the book, which is coming out on January 14th, is his new book, Aflame: Learning from Silence. Silence is something which is anathema to the technology world. We struggle with silence because from a business perspective, silence can often mean no money. From a technology perspective, it can often mean nothing's happening. The computer has stopped, the device isn't working. And from an interaction perspective, silence, one-way communication or no communication, can often mean that information and even thought from a technological perspective isn't happening. But when we think about silence and we think about the world more broadly, the space for silence is while crowded out, is essential. We need silence in order to process our day. Our brains look for relative silence in order to not only clean the body, but also clear out the extraneous, clear out information that we don't need to survive, or maybe that we don't want to hold on to, and retain that which we do. And of course, if you have the luxury of silence, you have the ability to think, to perceive, right? And to experience life in a way which you simply won't without it. And so in Pico's new book, Pico spends time talking about his experiences visiting and spending time in a monastery and among monks. And of course, monastic life is also seemingly anathema and, as Pico points out in the book, disappearing in modern times. In that experience, Pico shares not only his experience in how he perceived himself and how he perceived the world around him in visiting this monastery, which he came to and then left and came to over a period of years, but also talks about the people whom he came across. People who had suffered tragedies in their life, people who were there because they thought they might find some spiritual awakening, and people who had often stumbled upon those experiences, as well as the monks themselves, where Pico traces not quite their lives, but as much the growth and also the weariness that exists when you are in those spaces like that. Of course, and I will ask Pico about this, the title of the book is Aflame, and fire, and of course the tragedy of fire in destruction, but also the light which it brings, is something that is very much a theme in Pico's book. It is an incredible read, and it is a book that I read more than once, and oftentimes when I'm reading a book more than once, I'm doing it because I am preparing for Hearsay Culture. In this case, I knew I was going to have to read the book a few times because I wanted to gather as much as I could from it. For those that aren't familiar, Pico is an acclaimed and best-selling author of more than a dozen books translated into 23 languages. Most recently, the national best-selling The Half-Known Life in Search of Paradise, which was named a New York Times Top 100 book and a Time Magazine Best Book of 2023. His journalism, which I have read over the years, appears in everywhere from the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Harper's, and more than 250 other periodicals. His 4 TED Talks have received more than 11 million views. He divides his time between Western Japan, where he is right now, and the Central Coast of California. And I should note that his book has an endorsement from a person that some people might have heard of on Hearsay Culture, none other than His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which is an endorsement that you don't often see on books anywhere, and certainly I think it's worthy. Pico is joining us, at least in the United States, on Christmas, in Japan on the day after Christmas via Zoom. Pico, thank you so much for joining us today on Hearsay Culture.
I'm so really thrilled I get to talk to you, Dave. Thank you for such a rich and generous introduction. You now hold the world record, maybe apart from my editor and me, the number of times you've read my book, and it only just arrived on your doorstep. So thank you so much. And as I was listening to you, I was thinking 2 things, though I'm not a technology expert, but I've always felt that technology gives us everything except a sense of how to make wise and discerning use of technology. And for that, we'd have to go offline and often into quiet. And I've always been impressed that so many people in Silicon Valley practice digital detox or internet Sabbaths, go offline for maybe 24 hours every week so that they'll have much more creative and fresh material to share when they're online again. And the other thing I think I was reflecting on as I was listening to you is that all of us know we have to make a living and we have to make a life. And we know that technology is integral to making a living. The world couldn't function without it. But when it comes to making a life, we have to go somewhere else than our machines, I have found. And my question for myself is always, what do we bring to the ICU? Everyone listening to this program will have disasters in their life, will have challenges, and will suddenly find themselves in a hospital visiting a friend or a loved one. What do we have to bring to that situation? And in my experience, my bank account hasn't helped me very much. My resume is no use at all. All the books that I've written that you mentioned, not really much help. I found that the only thing I can bring when my mother's in the hospital, say, is whatever I've gathered in quiet, my inner resources, my inner savings account, as it were. So going to silence more than 100 times over 33 years, it's kind of an investment I make for the many times when life is going to throw me off balance.
And getting right to that, Pico, over 100 times you visited this monastery. Share with the listeners a little bit about this place itself and what made you keep and allowed you to keep coming back.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start at the very beginning
Yeah.
because you did mention fire and the fact that the book is called A Flame. So, quite a few years ago, I was in my family home in the hills of California, and I went upstairs and I saw we were encircled by 70-foot flames. It was the worst fire in Californian history at that time, and it had broken out just up the road. And by the end of that evening, I'd lost not only my house, but every last thing in it. And so, for many months thereafter, I and my mother were sleeping in a friend's house, and I was sleeping on the friend's floor as we slowly reconstructed our lives. And at one point, another friend came in, and he saw me there. He was a school teacher, and every spring he took his students up to this quiet retreat house in Big Sur, California. And he said, even the most phone addicted, fidgety, agitated 15-year-old Californian boys only had to spend 3 days in silence, and something calmed down and cleared out, just as you were saying in your introduction, to the point where many of these kids never wanted to go back home again. And I thought anything that works for a 15-year-old kid is probably ideal for me. And my friends stressed, if nothing else, I'd have a bed to sleep in, a large desk, a private walled garden looking out over the Pacific Ocean, meals, showers, all for $30 a day. So I thought, what's to lose? And I mean, your connection with Stanford, Big Sur already is one of the most unworldly, powerful places on earth. Somehow the calendar falls away, the pressures of the outside world disappear as you're on that 60-mile stretch of coastline, and you're brought to something very essential, I think, and elemental. And also, of course, and this is, of course, so close to where many of your listeners are in around Palo Alto, high redwoods, tall cliffs, the vast expanse of the ocean, and suddenly the human being is very tiny, which I think is a useful thing to remember when sometimes we think we're the center of the world, as maybe I think sometimes. And the one other thing maybe I'll say in this context is that this turns out to be a Benedictine monastery, and I'm not even a Christian. And I was so touched that these monks were opening their hearts and opening their doors to anybody, whatever your background, whatever your lack of background. They were confident you would find what you needed just by walking above the radiant ocean and being quiet for a while. So there are no rules there. It's not a guided retreat. You can do anything, or you can do nothing for 3 days, or you can just take walks or read. If you want, you can consult them for counsel, but otherwise, I don't do that, and I don't go to the services. But still, it's a rare trip I've taken where every time pretty much I come back home, I'm refreshed, I'm calmer, I'm a better version of myself.
And it is interesting because as a monastery, one would think that there was is a Christian religious aspect to it, and yet you do comment repeatedly that the monks themselves don't feel a particular need to convince you that you need to follow a religion or their religion, but at the same time, it is a spiritual place. Describe that dichotomy for us.
So, my sense is a spiritual place is by definition a place where we don't need words. or explanations. If you're taking a hike in the Himalayas, if you're in love with somebody, if you're moved to tears, those are often spiritual experiences. But the last thing we need is to try to formulate them. They're beyond the reach of words. And one reason I stress silence in this book is I've never seen the world as divided as it is now. Because as soon as we start talking about our beliefs, you maybe have one political party and I have another, or you're committed to one religion, we're apart. But as soon as we're brought together in a silence, I think we're brought to something deeper in ourselves, which is common ground. And that's why when 100 people are linked in a moment of silence, I think we're all brought to the part of us that exists beyond our ideologies and our divisions. In terms of the monks, you're absolutely right. And one of the beauties of going there was I was quickly liberated from all my preconceptions. So instantly, I found the monks were the least dogmatic people I know, much less dogmatic than I am, or than most of my friends are. And I realized that those people who are really deeply committed to a faith are the ones most ready to learn from everybody. You mentioned His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and I've been lucky to talk and travel with him for 50 years now. And what always strikes me is that the Dalai Lama, as the most prominent Buddhist in the world, will give long lectures to Christians on the Gospels, and tears will come to his eyes as he's talking about certain of Jesus' parables. And conversely, these very devout Catholic monks teach at the Zen, at the Tassajara Zen Center across the hills. When you step into your little retreat room, there's a pamphlet, and on the opening page, it cites the Hindu Rig Veda, and it says the father of monasticism, of course, is the Buddha. If you go into their bookstore, lots of books on Sufism and all kinds of things. So I should stress, this is the most contemplative congregation within the Catholic Church. And they've actually been given a dispensation to engage with other religions. So that's pretty much their job, as the Vatican sees it. And in the spirit of Vatican II, which I believe said, anything that's true and holy in any tradition is of value to us, and we need to respect it and learn from it. And so they're living that out. And I would say, I think probably the majority of people staying there are not Catholic, maybe not affiliated with any religion. I'm not affiliated with any religion, but I'm guessing nearly all of them come away restored.
And we're chatting with Pico Iyer, the author of the new book, Aflame, Learning from Silence on KZSU-FM Stanford and Hearsay Culture on the Hearsay Culture Network. I going through your book and reading it as I did, Pico, I think the book calls for the reader to reflect on their own experiences even in reading, but also to try to find parallels. And I want to share a parallel with you with regard to that I want to get your reaction to. So I am Jewish, but I grew up in northern Westchester in New York, which as you know has a enormous Catholic community. In fact, most of my friends were Catholic, and my hometown of Ossining has a few dozen churches, even though there's about 30,000 people in it. I learned to play tennis at Maryknoll Sisters, the convent, which is quite well known. Maryknoll is in Ossining, although it has its own zip code. But much as you describe your experience going to the monastery, and I don't think you can do this anymore, just simply because I don't think it's as, unfortunately, the world being what it is, it's not as easy to simply walk onto the property, although I could be wrong. But they had tennis courts. And I really didn't have access to tennis courts, and the high school didn't have access to tennis courts. So we would go over to Maryknoll and we'd play tennis. And the sisters would come out periodically and bring us water. And without any the first time they did this, we thought they're going to tell us we have to leave. And we were playing tennis, but it was quite the opposite. But they also, to your point, they were just simply happy to have us enjoying the outdoors and playing tennis and being ourselves. And what struck me about that under the heading of silence is the willingness to allow others to be themselves in a world where so much judgment occurs, where we are encouraged, right, to offer opinions, to offer our thoughts, and to demand of others that they hear them. Silence is very much the opposite of that.
Exactly. And I think one of the other surprises that goes exactly along with what you were just saying is that I'm an only child. I love being by myself. To have a room of my own above the Pacific Ocean in Big Sur, what could be more wonderful? But it was only by being alone there that I realized I was never alone. And the first thing I realized was that when I stay with the monks, as they often allow me to do, theirs is the opposite of a silent and quiet life because they're constantly bustling around looking after one another and looking after their guests and making sure everyone's comfortable. And the for them, their silent meditation is really a gateway to compassion and to community and to understanding how to give more to other people. But the bigger surprise was that going there, I was just basking in the sensation of having a whole day free to myself. Every day seemed to last 1,000 hours. But when I would walk along the monastery road above the ocean, sometimes I'd pass another fellow traveler, another retreatant, and we'd stop and talk for maybe 3, 4 minutes. And very quickly, I felt I trusted that person. I felt closer to that person than anyone I would meet on the sidewalk in New York City or Santa Barbara or wherever else it might be, because we weren't joined by our resumes, by the jobs we were doing, by our hometowns, by which college we'd been to. We were really joined by something much more profound, which is we'd both come in search of silence. And so we were speaking from our deepest parts. And as you said, I loved it when you said that those nuns were really wanting you to be yourself, which is to be your very best self, the part of you that gets lost when you're running around. You know, T.S. Eliot, the poet, wrote about the life we've lost in living. And I think anyone at Stanford or around Silicon Valley knows that these days we're racing around so much that sometimes we feel we're losing something essential and we don't know how to recover it and we don't know even how to formulate it. But we sense that. You know, more than 50 years ago, Simone Weil, the French mystic, wrote, the problem is not that there isn't bread available, it's that we don't acknowledge or see that we're hungry. But I think many people, I'm sure, listening to this conversation feel that something's missing in their lives and don't know quite how to repair it. And I find I'm caught in this super accelerated lifestyle, almost living at a post-human pace. And then I wonder why I'm so lost and confused and why actually I've lost my humanity along the way. And it's only by doing something quite dramatic and conscious to free myself from that vicious cycle. Because I think often we're in such a hurry, we don't realize what a hurry we're in. Until suddenly, maybe we have to stay in bed because we're sick or something happens, a pandemic happens. Suddenly, we're stopped in our tracks. And we realize, my goodness, we've been starving ourselves. And when I first went to the Hermitage, it was 1991. So at least for me, there was no internet then. Of course, no smartphones, no social media, very few distractions. But even then, just to spend 3 days away from telephone and television was quite a liberation. I could hear myself think. I could hear myself not think. I could remember what I cared for. I think if my friends were to ask me, why do you go? I would say it helps me to remember what I love because that gets lost. In every day, I'm racing from the bank to the pharmacy to the supermarket, and I lose a sense of priorities. And I find in my head and on my desk are 1,000 things, and I can't sift what is trivial from what's essential. And when a fire starts roaring towards my house, I can't put my head on what's really important. There's too much clutter in my head and in my life. So even in 1991, I was glad for that liberation. But the world has accelerated, as we all know, unimaginably in the last 33 years. And I think the urgency of just freeing ourselves from the rush is more poignant than ever.
We're chatting with Pico Iyer, author of the book Aflame, Learning from Silence. Pico, you said something a little while ago, and I want to come back to it now. You're talking about our divided world, and you know we are recording again on Christmas Day, 2024, a radically new administration in the sense that returning to the Trump administration here in the United States, but also we see in the EU, right, the rise of groups that have more nationalistic and isolationist viewpoints. We saw, just a short, few years ago, the almost unheard of assassination of a former Japanese prime minister. I mean, we see a world that again, and that's kind of what I want to focus on, again divided. As you look at these cycles, right, over the periods of time and the books you've written, what do you see are there things that you see that are different about the nature of the divisions that we have today that would give rise to writing a book like this, but also thinking in terms again of learning from silence?
Well, I think most of your listeners know much more about many of these things than I do, but I do feel that social media has made us more and more violent and more intemperate, and we can broadcast our opinions to the world. And we've all experienced that the louder the opinions, the more greater an impression they make. So the quiet, nuanced voices get lost along the way. And I've been working, as you said in your introduction, for 42 years with the major mainstream media, Time Magazine, the New York Times, all of those. And the one thing I've learned from that is what, again, we mostly sense, which is the news almost always concentrates on reasons for despair. And there are very few reasons for hope, even on Christmas Day when you and I are speaking. And yet, it's not as if there aren't reasons for hope in the world. And I think one reason I wrote this book was I could see more and more of my friends were not just more divided than ever, but more desolate than than ever. And I wanted to see how I could offer them light and inspiration. I remember during the pandemic, when really almost everybody on the planet was in the same situation. Every day when I woke up, I thought I have a choice. I can either listen to what's going to cut me up and make me feel absolutely hopeless and powerless, which is following the news and learning that 2,000 people had just tested positive in Bolivia and that the morgues in Iran were overcrowded. Or I could luck out on this beautiful Californian day and think of all the things that open me up. And I think we have a choice at any point which we're going to concentrate on. And the more we concentrate on reasons for hope, I think the more creative and fruitful our actions in the world can be. And as a journalist for 42 years, who spent a lot of time in war zones, I'm not suggesting we should turn away from the news, but just remember it's not the whole picture. And I think one of the reasons you probably noticed, especially over 3 readings, that the book is written in a very, very slow way. The opposite of the speedy things that usually come to us in, blogs or tweets or whatever. And it's partly to try to rescue the poor reader from the rush and remind her of the places inside herself that feel like an open meadow rather than the Wall Street. In other words, the places that are not absolutely crowded, but where she can actually remember something beyond what happened 6 seconds ago. Because I do feel we're very captive to the moment. And so we're losing the larger picture. And that's one reason I always go to this monastery. Because even in my life, as I was saying a couple of minutes ago, I lose a sense of proportion. And as soon as I go there, I remember this is what's important. This is what I should do for the next 3 months. And this is, where I can find sustenance and hope. And that's not something I feel when I'm caught in rush hour traffic on the 101 freeway.
Well, yes, no, exactly, and recognizing, of course, that you're not an expert on technology, but are by hook or crook, we all consume it, right? The need, the models around creating sustainable businesses, of course, drive us, as I said in the introduction, away from silence. It's notable though, is in the technological world, the number of leaders and thinkers who, while at the same time work in that space, sell products in that space, have themselves in their personal practice avoided it. Steve Jobs, late Steve Jobs, is famous, right, for not only his own stated concerns about literally the iPhone, but his need to quiet the mind. And in the time that I spent when I lived in Palo Alto, and my wife worked at a school there, the number of true giants in the technological field who were purposely sending their children to places that did not emphasize technology, in fact, eschewed it, right, in favor of learning different world languages and so forth, was startling. And that dichotomy is something that you talk about in the book. And I want to, as I was going through the book, I was looking for, because there's so much there, I was looking for these contrasts, and again, how your practices allow us to understand them. And, silence, of course, is a focus of the book. But of course, you talk about, in a sense, the opposite of silence. And what I see in the book is excess as being, in many ways, the opposite of silence. And I want to read very, very quickly. You have some, many side notes and direct notes about things that people said to you or shared with you, both monks and also individuals. And one that you share, and I'm just going to read it verbatim. You were asked, "How are you today, Pico?" The prior asked me at lunch, and your response was, "Well, too well." To which he responded, "Don't worry, we can fix that." Now, as I will say to you, as a Jewish person, it sounds like a very Jewish joke, right? The notion of enjoying yourself too much is somehow anathema to human experience. But you also have stories in the book about, for example, an individual who came to the monastery looking to give away a few $1 million, and the monks' response were, "Wait, don't do that, right? Until you have a better idea." What do you see as the role and the place of excess, right? Of excess, of overabundance, as it were, in our broader understanding of our lives and society today?
Well, I think at some point in my life, I discovered what I think many of us discover, which is luxury is defined not by having a lot of things, but by not needing a lot of things. Um, there's if you when you come to Japan, you will go to the famous temple known as Ryoanji in northern Kyoto, and there's an enigmatic rock garden there. But around the rock garden, from the rock garden, there's a little water basin, and there's one Japanese character on all four sides and a hole in the middle. And if you read the hole and the four characters, it says, "What I have is all I need." And I think at some level that's a recipe for content. And most of us know that, but we get caught up in needing to acquire more and more and then wondering why it's not making us feel happy. So, for example, I mean, I was leading the sort of very fast-paced, really exciting life covering world affairs for Time magazine. When I was in my 20s, I had an apartment on Park Avenue. I had a nice 25th floor office in Midtown, stimulating job. I could take my vacations in Bali and Morocco and El Salvador. Really, the life I dreamed of as a little boy. But I thought, I'm having such a good time. I can't tell how deep my happiness lies. And I could easily wake up when I was 70 and realize that I'd never checked any other option out. And I didn't want to die, as Thoreau said, feeling I'd never lived. So I threw over that life and moved to a single room in the back streets of Kyoto along the eastern hills. No toilet, no telephone, no bed. And I knew that whatever happened or didn't happen there, it would just offer a whole different set of experiences and perspectives in my life in New York City. Maybe having to do with freedom from excess and seeing how much I didn't need. And that was one of the lessons of losing everything I earned in the fire, too, because after the fire, when the insurance company came along and said, well, we'll replace all the goods you've lost, of course, I realized I didn't need 90% of the clothes and books and furniture I'd accumulated over the years. And I could live much more lightly, actually, the way I'd always told myself I wanted to live. So you're right that I think excess is a sort of illusion by which sometimes we get fascinated. And I loved the way you began that comment, because as I understand it, Steve Jobs made sure nobody ever used PowerPoint. Video game designers in Silicon Valley ensure, as you said, that their kids are not able to play video games. And one reason I'm so happy to be having this conversation with you and your listeners is it's almost like a parable that this place of quiet is so close to Palo Alto and Silicon Valley. They're almost like neighbors, and they're also like opposites. But I do sense that the more you're caught up in the whirlwind of the valley, the more you may be grateful for taking a drive 3 hours south and just stepping into quiet. And in fact, I meet many, many people from Silicon Valley there. As you know, I'm going to present my book in Menlo Park on January 14th. And the next day, I'm going to Apple and I'm going to talk to the huge mindfulness group there. And I've been over the years sometimes to Google, where again, I think they have 1,000 people actually qualified as yoga teachers, not just 1,000 practitioners, but 1,000 yoga teachers there. And it was at Google that a friend told me, and you're familiar with this, but it was an interesting notion to me, how every week he opened his calendar and made an appointment with himself. And he said, on Tuesday from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m., I'm going to meet myself, which maybe means he crashes out, maybe he takes a walk, maybe he meditates, maybe he collects his thoughts. But he realized it was only by meeting himself that he could do justice to the rest of his meetings and that he could actually gather things to share. And so when I go for 3 days on retreat, it's equivalent to that meeting with myself. And again, I noticed fairly early on, if I go for 3 days each season of the year, that's only 3% of all the days in my life, but it completely transforms the other 97%. And then, sort of inspired by that, I thought, well, wait a minute, if I just sit for 20 minutes every morning quietly in one corner of my room, not necessarily meditating, but without any devices, that's only 3% of my waking day. But again, maybe it would illuminate or completely transfigure the rest. And again, I should stress how incredibly grateful I am for technology. When I saw 2001 Space Odyssey years ago, I never imagined that I could talk to Dave across the world on Christmas and see you. Yeah, I mean, it just seemed something out of wild science fiction. And
Absolutely.
technology is what has allowed me to live for 32 years, 38 years, sorry, 38 years, 7,000 miles from my bosses. First the fax machine and email, now then Skype and now Zoom. But thank heavens for technology. It allows me to live in the place that makes sense to me, but still communicate so easily with all my bosses everywhere.
Well, and Pico, to that point, the hearsay culture has been from its inception about trying to understand how we can harness technology for good in that way, because as we know, there's also capacity for harm coming from it. We're chatting with Pico Iyer, excuse me, author of I'll get the name right eventually. Author of the Book of Flame, Learning from Silence on KZSU-FM Stanford and Hearsay Culture. On KZSU, we are a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station and require donations from listeners like you to continue our diverse programming. So consider making a donation to donate at kzsu.stanford.edu. Pico, one thing that struck me, and you I think you noted a little bit in the book, but I want to make it explicit, right? We're talking about people like Steve Jobs, and let's be clear, we're talking about people like you who have an enormous privilege to be able to step away from the world, right? I'm reminded of one of my favorite films that is a serious Woody Allen film called Crimes and Misdemeanors. And in that film, which involves a man who winds up basically hiring an assassin to kill his girlfriend, and then suffer, who's because he's married, and committing adultery, and in dealing with his own internal turmoil, he hires his brother, who's played by Jerry Orbach, by the way. Martin Landau is the main character, and brilliant actors. But he hires his brother, who's going to find the assassin. And then once the assassination happens, and apologies because I'm about to ruin the film for those that might watch it, so you can skip ahead about 1 minute if you think that the movie's more valuable than the question for Hearsay Culture listeners. The person who hires his brother, expresses remorse and shock that there would be as violent a world as there is. And Jerry Orbach, in what I think is a brilliant line, says to his brother, he says, you're up here in Scarsdale. And of course, most of the films take place in Westchester, wealthy area, right? At your pool. He says, but I am in the real world. And this is the line that as I was thinking about this luxury that I want to share with you, he says, I can't afford to be aloof. Right now, again, I mean, he's a hitman, he's a criminal, but the point that he's making to me is that it is a real privilege to be able to step away, even from the consequences of your actions, right? And most people can't afford to be aloof. Most people, in other words, and here's my question, right? Most people can't afford to take time away at the level that you have, right? And certainly the amount of times, and frankly, most people feel like they can't. Now, the whether they can is a normative question, but I'm curious your reaction to the point about you can't, because a lot of people would say, I can't afford it, I can't take the time, I can't do it the way that Pico has or the way that Steve Jobs has. Are we in that kind of world? Can we find the space for silence without going to a monastery, without having the luxury, again, I emphasize, to make these kinds of trips and do these kinds of things with our time?
Absolutely right. Such a good question, Dave. And of course, you're entirely right that many people can't afford the time or the money to go on retreat all the time, three days every season, as I try to do. But I think saying I don't have the time is often akin to saying I don't have the time to take my medicine. I don't have the time to be healthy. I don't have the time to go and see the doctor. And I think if we get too caught up in that acceleration, our health in the deepest sense suffers. I remember quite a few years ago, I went for my annual checkup with my doctor, and he looked at my blood test results. He said, you seem fine, but, always a but, he said, you're not getting any younger. So you need to put in 30 minutes of intense cardiovascular activity every day at the health club. So as soon as he said that, I religiously, as it were, signed up, and I do. Every day since, I pretty much go to the health club for 30 minutes. And later, I was talking to a quiet friend in Kyoto, American, and he said, "Look, you spend all your time flying around and answering emails and being a busy journalist. Have you never thought of just taking a few minutes free every day?" And I realized that was as essential as going to the health club, but it was about emotional health and mental health. And as the Dalai Lama always stresses, if your body is strong and your mind is weak, you're in trouble.
Mhm.
Whereas if your body is very weak and you're sick, but your mind is strong, as is sometimes the case with him, you can maybe get through um, the the days. So for those who don't have the opportunity to take 3 days, and as you said, there are many, many such as that, say take a walk, go and see a friend without your phone. And I think most people listening to our talk do this in some form. They take a run every day, or maybe they practice yoga, or they play basketball, or they play the piano, or cook, or sail. And I think we're all doing that, but we can all afford to do more. More than 100 years ago, J.P. Morgan said that he could never achieve in 12 months what he achieved in 10. In other words, he gave himself 2 months off every year so that he would be more productive. And I think, as you were sort of intimating earlier, so many of the leaders of large corporations and tech corporations make sure, Bill Gates takes his Think Week, and they all make sure they have that time. They are very privileged, as I am. But for those who aren't, there's always an opportunity in the day. I remember once I was talking about some of these themes on a radio show, and a young woman called up the show, and she sounded pretty angry. And she said, "Yeah, it's fine for a travel writer in Santa Barbara to talk all about this, but I'm a young mother with 2 kids, and I'm trying to start a business."
Right.
And I heard such agitation and anger in her voice, not just at me, but maybe at life. I thought, I wonder, it's probably not such a good thing for her kids to be on the receiving end. And if she took a walk for 30 minutes or practice meditation, she'd probably be able to do more justice to her children and to her business. So I think it's a useful thing. This all goes back to your question about excess.
Yeah.
I know when sometimes the Dalai Lama comes to Los Angeles and he'll be at some big fundraising gala in Beverly Hills. And many of the people in the audience are on their sixth wife and they're going to a therapist every day. And he'll say, "Your Holiness, how do you deal with the poverty in India?" And he looks around and he'll say, "Well, there's poverty and poverty, but there's a lot of material need in India and so many parts of the world. But I'm not sure there's always such a spiritual need there. And there may be more a spiritual anguish and loneliness in Los Angeles and Beverly Hills than there is in parts of Mumbai." My family's from India. And when I go there, as when I'm in Haiti or Ethiopia or many places, I feel that there's a strong sense of family, strong sense of community, and a strong sense of faith. And those are really the three things everybody needs to get through the challenges of life. And when I'm back in California, community and family and sometimes faith all seem a lot more fragile. And so I think it's important for us to do what we can to try to retrieve our sense of clarity and proportion, because otherwise we're only going to make a mess of everybody we touch.
We're chatting with Pico Iyer, author of the book Aflame, Learning from Silence on KZSU-FM Stanford and Hearsay Culture on the Hearsay Culture Network. You just said something there, Pico, that I want to come to as well, which I think is a colloquial understanding of what going to a monastery or going to a retreat. And I want to emphasize, you said something earlier, you're not talking about yoga retreats, which many people may be familiar with. You're talking about just literally spending time in a monastery and doing, as you said earlier, whatever you want to do. But I think there's a misunderstanding that also means being alone, physically being alone. And many times in the book, you talk about the need and your desire to be in silence among others, to be in
Mm.
silence among others, which again is so anathema to the technological world. Go on X, go on Blue Sky, and be silent among others is exactly not what the companies want, but it's also not what people generally are doing, although we might have that idea in lurkers, people that read but don't post. But I want to talk about that. What is the nature of being among others in silence that calls to you and that calls to others?
Well, I mentioned before that I think silence is what brings us together and words are what throw us apart. And so many of us don't feel comfortable going to a church or a temple or wherever. So we're not getting to share that silence with other people. And maybe a retreat like this offers us that opportunity. I've never been um, drawn to going to um, a guided retreat or a spiritual center of any kind, because I think often those are formed around one individual or one theology. And in this case, I'm so happy that I'm not being asked to believe in anything or to follow anyone, to subscribe to anything. It's just a thousand-year-old practice that has been found to make people calmer than they might be otherwise. I write, as you know, a lot about Henry David Thoreau in this book, and he's the perfect example of an American to whom many people would have said, "You're so aloof. Why are you going to live for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days in your cabin?" And if you go back and read Walden, he says he's only going to that cabin, excuse me, so he can be a better member of community. And in fact, he was a very gregarious, central part of the Concord community. He would hold melon parties every day, every year, and he would look after Emerson's wife and kids when Emerson was traveling, and he'd fix people's houses. And he deliberately built his cabin in Walden Pond next to the railroad that was speeding past 20 times a day to remind himself he didn't want to be away from the clamor. He's not trying to get away from society. He's trying to have much more to give to society. And he says in that book, "I'm not naturally a hermit, and I love society as much as anyone." And I was touched to find out that the very first lecture Thoreau gave at the Lyceum in Concord was not on the subject of solitude. It was on the subject of society. So that was really his concern. And I think being alone can be the best investment you make towards being a better member of society.
When thinking about society, and it struck me in reading, here in the U.S., there's a movie that came out recently about the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who of course, as if any listeners aren't familiar, a theologian who in Nazi Germany, who unclear how much he was involved, for example, in efforts to take the life of Hitler, but was involved in resistance at the same time, very much engaged as a Christian theologian. And I was reading in thinking about discussion today. I was thinking about Bonhoeffer, not only because the book is out, but because that contrast is what you don't write about Bonhoeffer. I want to be clear in the book, but that kind of contrast exists. And in Christianity Today, the review of the movie, which was mixed, said something which I want to get your reaction to, because it draws on community. The reviewer wrote, and I'm just reading verbatim now, in the aftermath of 2 assassination attempts on a former president, we don't need further justification for political violence. And the reason is that the review says that the book takes some liberties with Bonhoeffer's life, and I'll leave it there. But here's the key point. What we needed was a film, this is the reviewer's take on the movie Bonhoeffer, about a man concerned with how God might be calling the church to be steadfast amidst the great temptation to mold our faith to our politics, which I think is a very interesting contrast in the kinds of people that you come across in the book, because you describe visitors who are obviously looking for some kind of way to make sense of the experience that they have. And here in this story, right, in this movie, the author of this review is pointing out that what we really need, which the author doesn't believe this movie does, right, is to figure out a way to be steadfast in our belief structure, in ourselves, as opposed to molding ourselves to the world around us. And that molding ourselves to the world around us is very much a current that runs through the book. And I'm curious what your take is, not on the Bonhoeffer movie as much as about that comment, but also about the pressures that the world brings to us, right, to mold ourselves in the vision of others rather than trying to just be ourselves.
Yes, when you said earlier on, those nuns at Maryknoll were just trying to make you yourself.
Yeah,
I love that word steadfast.
yeah.
And I remember when my father, many years ago, suddenly got taken into hospital and died quite soon thereafter. I didn't know what to do. My mother was suddenly widowed. I'm her only child. It was the busiest time in our lives, lots of details to take care of. And one day, when I knew somebody was looking after my mother, I just got in the car. I drove 4 hours north, and I went to that monastery, and I just sat on a bench for 2 hours overlooking the sea. And I was reminded of what doesn't seem to change, which is the cliffs, the vast Pacific Ocean, the silence. And somehow that made the fact of change much less scary. And I think in this world of flux, we're longing for steadfastness of any kind. And I think maybe that's what many people get when they go to a place like the one I describe. As you know, in the book, there's one of many times when the monastery is completely encircled by forest fires, because there they are in a very remote wilderness in the Santa Lucia Mountains. And most of the monks leave, and just 3 monks stay to help the firefighters try to protect their home. And the prior sends out messages every day to concerned friends, such as myself. And one day he wrote and he said, "We can see a lot of smoke, and there are flames surging over the ridge 200 yards behind us. But don't worry, we're maintaining our offices every day. We're doing vigils and vespers and matins. Blessed day all." He signs off "Blessed day all" on the day when it looks like he could lose his life and his home.
Yeah.
So talk about a model of steadfastness. And even though I don't share his faith, I'm so moved by that and so moved by that degree of confidence. Sort of, oh, I want what he's having. I mean, it's a very inspiring thing to witness. And just when we talk about silence, I was remembering how many years ago, I once drove up into the high, cold, dark mountains behind Los Angeles. And I visited a Zen monastery, and this stooped man in a tattered black robe and a very unflattering cap and glasses came and took me into the cabin where I was to stay. And pretty soon I realized it was Leonard Cohen, 61 years old and living for 5.5 years as a monk. And at 61, having tasted all the pleasures that the world has to offer, and he could be doing anything with anyone at that point as such a celebrated songwriter and poet, he said, "This is a real deep and profound and voluptuous excitement in life. This is the great adventure." And it made a big impression on me that somebody who'd investigated every option would find, in his case, shoveling snow and scrubbing floors and looking after the very aged Japanese head of that community was where he found his delight and his fulfillment. And I won't go on this, but Leonard Cohen features quite a bit in my book, just to remind us that this isn't peculiar to the Benedictine monks. I think nuns and monks in every tradition share some of this open-heartedness. But Leonard Cohen was, without question, the most articulate writer I've ever met. I mean, probably most of your listeners know he could spin beautiful words all day. And yet, when I would visit him in his little house in Los Angeles after lunch, he'd take 2 little chairs and he'd put them out on a tiny lawn in front of his house. And I would sit down next to him, and then nothing. We'd sit and sit and sit. And I think this speaks to many of the questions you've been asking. And I remember the first time this happened, I thought, oh, this is a gentle hint. So I said, "Oh, you must be busy. I should leave you." And he
Yeah.
looked up at me beseechingly, "Please don't go."
Right.
So this most spellbinding of writers and poets had realized that the deepest thing he could share, the greatest act of friendship he could offer anyone who came by, was sharing silence. And I gather many people who would visit his house would end up just sitting next to him in absolute silence. And in fact, the name he was given in the monastery, Jikan, by the head Japanese monk, means the silence between two thoughts. So it's just another example of how those who live off words, like Leonard Cohen, still see that the truth probably arrives when the words run out.
Pico, one of the themes here, and we have about 10 minutes left. One of the themes, of course, which runs through the book is movement, right? You're going to different places, you're meeting different people, you may be returning to the same place, and of course, as I mentioned in the introduction, right? You travel between the West Coast of the U.S. and Japan. Travel, obviously, and you've alluded to it several times in the interview, has played an enormous part in your life, and at the same time, which is a blessing. The internet brings us closer together, but it isn't the same as being in physical presence. We are recording via Zoom, and I am as grateful as you are for this technology, because this would not happen otherwise. But it is not the same as being in the same space, as being in the same room. You see the top, you see basically from my shoulders up, I see your shoulders up. I mean, there's a whole variety of things, just sharing the same air. Describe a little bit what you see as the necessity of not just travel, but also of those interactions with individuals in different spaces, in different environments, but also going to each other's places of comfort.
I'm so glad you asked that, Dave. And again, there's too much I could say about it. But I'll begin by saying that I'm so grateful that technology makes it so easy to buy a plane ticket and reserve a hotel and take care of everything in 2 minutes now. And I do that all the time. But I think the first rule of travel is leave expectations at home. So in that sense, I don't want to know what my hotel room is going to look like when I fly to Kyoto tomorrow, because if it looks exactly like in the photo, I'll be disappointed. And if it doesn't look like it's in the photo, I'll be disappointed.
Right.
The second rule of travel is you really want to get lost. So I'm very glad I don't have a GPS, because as I'm walking the streets of Paris, I don't want to have a strict sense of where I'm going to go. I want to find an alleyway and go somewhere I never dreamed of going and find something I never thought to see. And the third rule of travel, just as you were saying, is it's all about human connection. And so I don't want to be walking down the street either peering at the phone or having it vibrate in my pocket as I'm meeting some fascinating stranger. And I think to answer the other part of your question, I worry that seeing so much of the world through screens means that we're really only getting two-dimensional visions of the world. And we're missing out on what is the most important part, of, as you said, of any interaction, which is humanity and texture. And I feel that in the age of information, we actually know less about the rest of the world than ever before, and least of all about the countries we hear most about. So, for example, I've been to North Korea a couple of times. I was in Iran not so long ago. I tend to go to places very much in the news. I used to go to Cuba every year. And in all those cases, we know something about their leader and something about their faltering economy, something maybe about their nuclear policies, but painfully little about daily life and regular folks. And I think the illusion of knowledge is worse than ignorance. In my grandparents' day, they couldn't have assumed they knew anything about North Korea or Iran. They might get a paragraph in a newspaper. They'd never seen an image. They'd never seen a video of those places. So they knew we don't know much about Afghanistan. Now, many of us sitting in California or Japan can see endless footage of Afghanistan. And so we think, oh, we know everything that's going on there. And in my experience, as soon as we arrive, we find we don't know a thing. And it was an interesting experience when I went to Iran. I'd actually, before I'd gone there, 30 years before I'd gone there, I'd written a long article on Iran, drawing from colleagues' reports, though I'd never been myself for Time magazine. And then I financed my first book by writing a 20-page article on Iranian history for the Smithsonian magazine. And then later, I spent 4 whole years of my life reading up on and researching everything I could get about Iran and Islam. And I published a 350-page novel, partly set in Iran, though I'd never been. So
Mm.
when I arrived in Iran, I thought I'd been studying this place for 30 years. I know quite a bit. And honestly, Dave, I'm not exaggerating when I say within 4 hours, I saw I didn't know a thing. All the reading and research I'd done never prepared me for this country of surprise. And of course, vice versa. I think when an Iranian or North Korean arrives in America, instantly she finds this radically different from either the propaganda she's heard or the images she's seen on screen. So getting so much of the world on screen, I think, is really, really dangerous. And actually, it makes experiencing something in the flesh more valuable than ever. And we all know this because let's say you're a fan of Taylor Swift. You could probably see 200 videos of her concerts online tonight in the comfort of your home. Such high definition, so vivid you could count the beads of sweat on her face. And yet her fans will spend more and more money to go and see her in a huge stadium, maybe following the action on a big video screen, just to get the sense of something unedited, unpredictable that's never seen before. So
Yeah.
the more we're getting on screen, I think the more we're longing. That's why business people will fly across the world to have a 20-minute meeting in person, because they know, just as you said, what's not coming through on Zoom, the silences, the glances, the texture of things.
We're chatting with Pico Iyer, the author of the book of Flame, Learning from Silence. Pico, we have a couple of minutes left, and I want to ask you for some advice. I am a father. There's many people who listen to Hearsay Culture are at the beginning of their careers. I'm not just talking about law students, but people beginning right in society. And your book, to me, right, is a clarion call, not just for a return to the kinds of values that allowed people to have engagement and to have community. But I think it's also a return to a more thoughtful and less reactive experience in life, where we are pressured to react and offer opinions, thumbs down, thumbs up, hearts, emoji, and all the other stuff. A 13-year-old is sitting in front of you and says, sir, decades of travel, decades of experience, the people that you have just mentioned, any one of the people you just mentioned, your visits to North Korea, Iran, the Dalai Lama, Leonard Cohen, and so forth, could be the subject of an hour interview easily, right? What do I take from that? What can I do in my young life to position myself to have the kind of mindfulness and the kind of engagement in the world that would allow me to, and I say this very seriously, survive in a world which while there are many blessings, and you're absolutely right that we don't spend enough time talking about them, is also increasingly challenging, and particularly as we're recording on Christmas Day 2024, polarized. What do you say to that 13-year-old? What do I do? What is, to the extent there is, a roadmap?
Such a great question, Dave. Thank you. I would say simply make sure you're spending as much time on your inner life as your external life. And the external is so overwhelming and it drowns so much out now that our inner life gets more and more shrunk. And then we are reactive, but we're making the wrong reactions. We don't know how to respond to the many dramas that come to us every day. 500 years ago, somebody called Meister Eckhart said, as long as the inner work you do is puny, whatever form that takes. Sorry, as long as the inner work you do is strong, the outer will never be puny. In other words, take care of that landscape inside yourself, and then your relationships, your job, your understanding of yourself, all that will take care of itself. But it's like if you're driving a car, don't bother endlessly repainting it. Get under the hood and take care of the engine. That's the only thing that matters. And the engine is our imagination, our mind, our subconscious, but it has very little to do with the responses that we quickly come up with, as you were saying. And it's interesting, I meet many teenagers who tell me, my parents took me on a cruise ship or on a long hike, and there was no cell phone connection. We couldn't get online at all. And that first day, man, it was the worst day of my life. It's just miserable. I couldn't talk to my friends. I couldn't play games. I couldn't do anything. It's just I didn't know how to live. And the second day, it was just the second worst day of my life. It's like I was a dead person. There's nothing for me to do the whole day. And that week was the best week of my life. In other words, once you do cold turkey in any form, suddenly you remember what you're missing. And it's always difficult, of course, to get away from any addiction. But I think young people, and maybe this takes us back to the very beginning, why did my school teacher friend take his 14 and 15-year-old kids up to a silent Benedictine monastery for 3 days every spring? Because it would show them what they're missing and what maybe they didn't know they were missing. And then maybe it would move them to live a little differently when they went back home. So, yes. Sometimes, once I was giving a talk to a hospice organization, and they said at the very end, akin to your question, what's the one piece of advice you give to any of us? And they're probably expecting some great moral wisdom. And I said, take a walk.
Yeah, yeah. And it's something that I say to my sons regularly, and it's something that I attempt to do every day, and as a human being who has failures, don't always do. But perhaps your book, Aflame, Learning from Silence, will encourage me and certainly anyone who reads the book and listens to the interview to do that. The author is Pico Iyer, the book, Aflame, Learning from Silence. Pico, thank you so much for joining us today on Hearsay Culture and for discussing your life and your work and this wonderful book that's coming out in the new year.
Thank you, Dave. It's been a real honor, and thank you for reading my book 3 times. I'm humbled.
It is my pleasure. Hearsay Cultures on the Hearsay Culture Network and on KZSU. Check out our webpage at hearsayculture.com. We're also on the major platforms, and in the new year we'll be on YouTube to listen to not just the KZSU show, but R&D with D&D and Uneven Distribution. I'm Dave Levine. Thank you for listening today. Go take a walk. Maybe listen to Hearsay Culture while you're doing it. And thank you so much for tuning in today.